Welcome to The Memory Game, a podcast where I, Nathan Tuffin,
and I, Rob Beer, exchange voice notes as we carry out the important work of recording an emotional history of video games
for the betterment of future generations. This week, Rob gets us to stop and take in the view as we consider the landscapes and scenery we think about most often in games.
Hey there, you mainstream spooner. I've been sat thinking about the Sopranos test experience and that quote we still didn't manage to hunt down, which is the idea that a film is a slow, soft bullet to the brain. And the idea of games as a sort of visual medium, that you're often, what's most pleasing about them is the environments that you're exploring. And that is obviously a pretty broad topic. So I was trying to narrow it down a bit rather than just talking broadly about the visuals in games. And so I've tried to narrow that down to landscapes or scenery. So I guess my question is, what are the landscapes or scenery in games that you think of most often, or that have stuck with you in ways that you think about a lot of the time? The first one that leaps out to me, and this I guess is a example of the idea that a painter always draws the same tree, is Hyrule Field in the Ocarina of Time. So that's a game that is absolutely seminal for me in terms of the time that I played it, and the sort of breadth and scope and scale of that game was massively impressive at the time in a way that's difficult to understand just by playing that now. It was something that was amazingly recaptured in the Breath of the Wild game. That in a way was a sort of relaunch of the series, a reimagining of the Zelda/Link series, because it managed to reinterpret and reimagine some of the tropes of those games in a way that breathed new life into them, breathed new wildlife into them. And specifically there, the moment that I was thinking of there is when you first glide off that main island, sort of tutorial island in Breath of the Wild, you get a sort of sense of the scope and scale of the game, and how small you are situated in it. And Hyrule Field is the sort of main middle of the map in Ocarina of Time. It's the thing that you keep having to sort of traipse across. But yeah, and it was one of those things I remember talking to people about it. It was like, it takes like 20 minutes to get across it, and it definitely does. It takes like 3 minutes. And with Ocarina of Time as well, it had a thing where if you tap the A button, they would do a little roll like... That's the loop of the sound effects. So you do this little like forward roll, and it was marginally quicker than just running. So everywhere you went, you were just rolling. But from that point, you can also see the mountain. There's like a river running through it. There's a castle. It's just, a real visual feast. And to go straight into the show notes, there is a website called Noclip, which lets you do a sort of ghost mode thing where you can fly around the map. And that's very interesting, and also quite revealing of how they sort of bodged some of it, how the little tricks and illusions they used to try and create a sense of bigger scale. So that's well worth checking out for anyone who is willing to have some of their illusions shattered about it. But yeah, that's the one, as I say, that I guess any game that does that thing, which tries to show you that the size and scale of the game, for me, that's just trying to recapture that original moment in that game. And it obviously has been done better since, but it'll never top it emotionally for me. Another game that took a slightly different approach, or at least unlocked a different feeling there, or a new way of accessing that feeling of awe, was an indie game called Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, which was a game where you play two brothers, and you play it on a console, and the left thumbstick controls one brother and the right thumbstick controls another, which is an interesting mechanic. And in its own right, you'd imagine that would be quite a small game, but they really threw a lot at it and created it on a scale that I guess a decade before would have been unimaginable, that you could take like a small concept like that and create a sort of 10-hour long, I don't know if it's 10 hours long, but a long indie game. And it's got that, beautiful Xbox 360 3D art style to it. But the moment that I think about all the time with it is there's a bit where you're going through a sort of cave and you're unlocking things and pushing blocks and all of that puzzle stuff that you need to make a game like that work. And then eventually you emerge and it's not quite clear what you're looking at initially, and then you get it, that you're looking at like a battleground, and there's the corpses of all these bodies around, but they're like giant. It's like a giant's battleground, and so you have to navigate your way through it by like. There's a bit I think you have to like knock an axe over it so it chops a hand off so that it rolls out of the way of your path or whatever. But it was just that thing where you go from feeling like you're in this small enclosed space, or at least like a sort of tight space, and it's a way of really getting you to feel small again, that suddenly you are literally a 20th of the size of the landscape you're going through. And just like really is a thing that recaptures that sense of imagination and like the ability to do a leap of imagination like that. I just thought it was amazing. And then my last example that I was thinking about, one that I often end up thinking about, was Firewatch. And one of the reasons I think it stuck with me is that in the game they give you a camera and it has no sort of functional purpose, in that the photos in it aren't used as like objectives or goals. Like you cannot use the camera at all and it doesn't affect the narrative or the storyline-ish. In that, what then happens is like sort of during the credit sequence, you see the credits play out over the photographs you've taken out. But without knowing that beforehand, you're not sort of encouraged to take them in a way that like is required. But I think one of the reasons you do end up taking it is the story is spacious and interesting and makes you think that there might be a purpose to taking the photographs. But the other is it does this amazing thing with light, that throughout the game the light shifts, the sort of sunset and the colour palette slowly and subtly shifts in a way that's both visually stunning and like leads to the emotional tone of the game. Like what a thing to be able to do. The art style of it, although it's first person and therefore a bunch of assumptions are made there about it being in a sort of 3D environment, they did stuff with sort of shading that I can't describe because I don't have that sort of artistic eye, but that just absolutely does it for me. And it was my desktop background for a long time, was the sort of vista landscape scene of Firewatch. So that alone, that it being my desktop for 3 or 4 years, says to me that it passes the Sopranos test. So what are the landscapes and the scenery that stick with you most? And you better not say the skyline of number 4 in the series of a game series that we know you want to mention.
Hey, Painter's Tree. Thank you for this question, buddy. I guess it was sort of inevitable this would happen at some point because we're talking about games a lot at the moment and following these sort of various threads in our minds. But I've genuinely spent the last few days since we recorded the Nostalgia episode thinking about beautiful views in games. So you would think I would have some sort of answers at my fingertips already, except that I think 2 of my immediate answers would have been Red Dead Redemption 2 and Death Stranding, which both have, stunning visuals and these beautifully crafted landscapes and the ability to stop and take pictures a bit like in Firewatch. But I used both of those as my examples in the last episode, and the reason that I've been thinking about landscapes is because I've been going back through screenshots I took in those games, following our conversation. So I'm giving them honourable mention at the top here, but before I go on to share some other examples that I've thought about and that, meet the criteria you've set out. So in listening to your answers, I couldn't agree more, really, that developers are sort of actively, clearly trying to recapture these sort of moments, like, seeing Hyrule Field for the first time in Ocarina of Time. And now it's almost become a bit of a trope, hasn't it, for there to be these moments in open world games where you come over a hill or you move into a new area and you're just sort of struck by a magnificent view of the open horizon with a stirring bit of music playing in the background. And you can imagine that scene being played as a teaser at, E3 or whatever the big video game industry events are now. And I got thinking about why that is so powerful when playing games, and why we remember those moments, why they stick with us. And obviously, one of the main functions of those kind of big horizon reveals is to show the player, look, this is how big this playground is you've got to explore. Look at the size and the scale, and this is just a glimpse of all the amazing experiences you're about to have. And I think for me what that signifies, or why it is exciting, is because it fills, our imaginations with so much potential for what the experience might be and of what's to come. And that's a really great feeling that is, we try and recapture. And it reminded me of this sort of feeling I used to get when I was a kid, when I got a new toy or an action figure or whatever, and I brought it home for the first time, and there was this sort of brief window of a few hours where I wasn't just excited to play with the toy, but I was excited that it belonged to me now, and that I had the potential for all of these different games and scenarios I might play with it, forever in my mind. And the difficult thing is that now modern games have such power and capacity, and we know so much about games before they come out, that it is sort of harder to be impressed by the potential of a game. Well, I think so anyway. And we can still enjoy and bask in the sort of beauty of it, but that sort of surprise at how big the area of play is and everything it has to offer, that's definitely less impactful. And in the opposite, a few times in recent years I've played games that are so huge, and I'm sort of thinking of those new wave of like vast space exploration games like Elite Dangerous and No Man's Sky. They're so big that it's almost intimidating. Like, these games have so much to explore. I know I won't even be able to scratch the surface of it, and almost like, what's the point? And actually, after a bit of sort of further thought, I think even if I hadn't chosen Red Dead 2 in the last episode, I probably would have missed it out of my examples here, just because, it's got some of the most stunning views a game has probably ever produced. But it truly knows that about itself as a title, and you so often come to a new bit of the map that has been engineered to be breathtaking, and the game will pipe in a bit of music from nowhere to score the view, and it's almost too self-aware, I think, in that sense. So most of my choices are actually older games where I was still able to sort of be surprised and excited by the potential that these horizons and visuals offered. And I've also made sure to keep the Sopranos test in mind, which I hugely appreciate you picking up so swiftly and helping to make it a thing right off the bat. So my first choice is a game called PlanetSide, which I played on the PC in the early 2000s, and it was the first MMO, massively multiplayer online game I ever played. And it was a large-scale first-person shooter. I feel like you could have hundreds of players on the map at the same time, which now I'm thinking about when it was released. That might actually be something I've imagined, maybe something for the research notes. But in the game, you joined one of these three factions, and then, you picked a loadout, and then you battled over regions on these huge world maps. And there was this kind of like organic push and pull between the factions where players would choose where to attack next and how to gain ground over the other factions. And I played it with my friend Tom, and he got the game first, and I remember playing it at his house for months before I got the game myself. And it was fraught with issues caused by slow internet and PC crashes, and it was a subscription-only game, so you needed like a parent's credit card to even play it. But when everything lined up properly, it was a really great experience. And my most sort of vivid memory from that game was probably the very first time I played it, sat next to Tom in his bedroom, and you spawned into this sort of general barracks type area, went outside, and then there were these troop carrying planes which were flown by other players, and you'd hop onto the plane and then get carried towards the battle, and just seeing out over this immense map from the sky, and it probably didn't even render that far, but you could just, you got such a sense of the scale. You knew you were flying towards a big old gunfight, and you're sort of waiting 30 seconds to get there. And I found that very impactful, and it did trigger this great sense of size and scale that I found so exciting at the time. And the funny thing is, unlike in a lot of open world games like the Zelda games or Red Dead's, the map wasn't actually really sort of full of fun and adventure. It was too big to enjoy really, unless you were in the 3 or 4 zones that had active combat in at the time. And a few times you would end up without of vehicle, stranded in some empty bit of the map that had no fighting going on, and it would end up you'd end up running for minutes and minutes of in-game time just to find a battle, and it was immensely tedious. But those early experiences of the game and the scale and this huge world that existed to fight over, I do think about that a lot, even though I've probably played a dozen games since that have done it better. So I think it fits the answer as a good answer to your question in that way. And just as like an aside, that game was also really hard. It had a really steep leveling system. We died all the time. I don't remember getting many kills at all. And I played PlanetSide 2 with my friend Justin a lot years later, and probably got more playable sort of fun game time from those experiences. But it was less impressive. It did make less of an impression on me than the first one, just because games had moved on by then, and there was nothing particularly groundbreaking about it at that point. My second choice is Star Wars Galaxies, again for the PC, which I mentioned a lot in an episode of the pre-season, but as those have now been fired deep into the archive for now, our listeners might not be familiar. So Star Wars Galaxies was another MMO from the early 2000s, which did a really great job of quite faithfully recreating the Star Wars universe, and then let you play and explore in it and take on a bunch of different jobs and get involved in the rebel, Imperial struggle and meet characters from the movies. And it was really rich and vibrant and full. And I loved the game for a dozen different reasons, which I won't go into now. But the world itself, the galaxy itself had been so beautifully made. And again, you would just find yourself coming to these big bits of game world that seemed so vibrant and open that the potential of it was absolutely intoxicating. And the thing to add on top of that was that it was in this world that you kind of already knew from the Star Wars films, and it had the John Williams score sort of rumbling away in the background, so it all seemed so epic. I think that's the other thing, and it still had this kind of quality of implying scale and potential of this huge game with the visuals you experienced, and there was just so much of it and so many planets to visit and so many different kinds of creatures. And I'm sure now if I look back at the screenshots it looks kind of ropey, but at the time I do remember being really stunned by it. So those are my first two choices. You've probably breathed a sigh of relief because I haven't included that well-known game series that always comes up. But if you thought there was any way to ask me this question about beautiful visuals and fill my head with thoughts about open-world games and their potential for fun without me choosing a GTA game as one of my answers, then you are crazier than Trevor Phillips.
Grand Theft Auto.
Better luck next time.
And GTA 5 definitely would have been a solid answer for me here. And it is a game where I did find myself stopping a lot to marvel at the views, especially in the countryside and beachy areas. And I remember when I played through it on the PS4, which was the second time I played through that game, the first being on the Xbox 360 and the last one on the PC. And I climbed up one of the big mountains as the character Michael and did one of the yoga mini games at the top of this mountain. And then as I was playing, my dad popped round and he kind of saw the view over my shoulder and was like, oh my God, what game is that? It's beautiful. And, my dad plays a lot of video games and open world video games, but still, I think it was so striking. It's like, it's a real sort of visual feast on the screen. So that was really something. But having said all of that, I'm not actually going to choose GTA 5 because of what I mentioned earlier, in that even though it's a lovely game to look at, it does come from an era where that is almost expected of those games. And the excitement and surprise is sort of dampened because you already know how big that game's going to be when you first turn it on. And so the one I'm actually going to choose is GTA Vice City, and specifically because it passes the Sopranos test, as I think about that game a lot, which is also ironic because I'm pretty sure there's quite a lot of voice actor crossover with GTA Vice City and the TV show The Sopranos. But the very first time I played Vice City, a couple of hours in, I sort of found myself driving along the seafront of that very first island where you have your initial sort of safe house in a hotel. And there was this lovely sunset in the background and the colours were really vibrant and warm. And I Ran by Flock of Seagulls came on the radio. And you could just see all along the beach, and there were NPCs walking up and down, and it completely captivated me. And I stopped to look at it, which is something I think I didn't do in games so much around that sort of age. I don't know how old I would have been, about sort of 13 or 14 maybe. And I think part of all of that was this sort of excitement of this new kind of colourful, upbeat setting compared to how gritty GTA 3 had been, and partially maybe this sort of novelty of there even being a beach in a game that you could explore, even though probably in practice there wasn't actually much in the way of interaction with that bit of map. It was just kind of there to look at. So those are my three choices, but I did want to do a final shout out to a few other games I've played where I did just have to sort of stop in my tracks and take in the view and take screenshots or use in-game cameras if they're available. And I didn't choose these ones for my proper answers because they didn't quite meet the criteria you laid out, but I did enjoy them for these kind of stunning experiences that they hold. And one is Valheim, which has been mentioned a few times on the pod already. There are some gorgeous views in that games, and travelling around by boat, which is the main way you kind of travel over long distances, you have this quite nice passive way of taking them in, especially if you don't like driving the boat and one of your friends does it, like when I was playing. And you get these islands kind of come up out of the fog, and they're just really, really beautifully rendered. Another one is Cyberpunk 2077, which is another game I bought to sort of try and test out. A recently built, gaming PC, monster gaming PC. And I wasn't hugely impressed with the game itself. It was a bit, had a few bugs and issues, but some of the scenery is truly beautiful and just, it looks almost real. It's so impressive. So that was another one that just, again, had some really beautiful horizons and visuals. And the last one I was going to talk about quickly is Astroneer, which I think I mentioned before. I played on big chunks of it with friends, and it has its own quite sort of cartoony, sort of bubbly, unique art style. And there are just loads of moments where it's fun to stop and sort of survey the landscape around you for how sort of well crafted it is, and look up at the sky. You can see moons and planets and stuff moving around. So yeah, those are all more recent game choices than my main choices, really. And I played them all as an adult, and that sort of got me thinking about stopping to let yourself experience beauty in games, and how, if any of those titles had existed when I was a child, I would have just blitzed past that scenery to get on with the missions or story or whatever else. And that just leads me to my counter question to end on. At what age do you think you started to notice beautiful design and art style in games and actively stop to try and appreciate and take them in as part of the experience of playing those games? All right, that's the whole load, buddy. Great question. Hit me up.
Hey there, GTA fan. Thanks for your responses. Good use of the sneaky, not my answers, but caveat what I would have said answers to get 5 games in. I am equally as guilty of that, so I don't think I should blow the whistle and call the referee for that. I think it's not a coincidence as well that you were thinking about Red Dead 2 as the answer that jumped out to you that you wouldn't use. Because that was my favourite thing about the original Red Dead, was riding around on a horse as the sun set by these big cliffs, and sort of the way that the shadows were cast on that. And it's absolutely a game that is all about environment and landscape, isn't it? That's the big selling point, is making you feel like a cowboy, which I suppose links back to the idea you were talking about, that sort of joy of owning a toy and that journey home with it. Potentially still wrapped or maybe unwrapped, but it's not just the object, it's the possibility. And what a lovely sort of vision or feeling to be able to recall and get. And it's us that's broken, that have lost the spark when we see those sort of scripted horizon reveals and we're sort of aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. There must be at least one person who's seeing something like that for the first time, and you've got to pass that torch forwards, haven't you? So maybe next time I come across one of those, I should try and greet it with wide open wonder, like I did the first few times, like the vision you were describing there of taking off on a ship in Planetside, or seeing the planets in Star Wars Galaxy for the first times. But it is hard, because I was thinking an example of what you were talking about there, and I was like, the Assassin's Creed reveals when you climb the towers, and it like when you reach the top of the towers and then it sort of spins round, it does the sort of 360 camera thing, doesn't it? And yeah, in the first couple of games, that when either sort of in Venice or I can't remember where the other games are set, but felt so cool. And then 3 or 4 times later, just like skip, hold X. Let me pass. I just need to tick this off so that I can go and stab someone. Yeah, again, that's the problem with us as players, not with the games themselves. I did some Googling as well and found that Planetside had a maximum number of players that could be loaded to each map that was 399, apparently, because there were 133 that could be loaded per faction. I mean, that's just sort of Reddit research, so the truth might be more complicated than that. But also it was oddly specific to just be made up, and also it had a lot of upvotes. So we'll have to just take that as the gospel truth. I also I liked that you were talking there about when you did eventually, obviously, mention GTA. One of the things why I think it keeps coming up in your answers is that there's such a breadth to that game. You were talking about this idea of doing a sort of mountainside yoga retreat, which exists in a game where you also can drive over sex workers, having sort of used them to get a health boost or whatever. I'm not sure if that's part of the GTA 5 game mechanics, but that was certainly one that was definitely in Vice City. And that was one of those things that we keep coming back to and failing to look up the term for, but lots of people discovered that you could do that simultaneously, although it was definitely something that was mentioned in magazines and stuff, and was sort of celebrated or treated with disdain, and part of the sort of scandal of those games, which I guess they were trying to generate. And there's probably things in GTA that you can do that you would never bother finding out, in terms of like trying to do things like that, which are sort of disturbing. And I guess, I wonder, moral soul-searching question, but are you still doing that kind of stuff? Are you playing like a sociopath? Because I think you've spoken to me before about your lack of moral code when playing GTA, and explaining it, justifying it by saying, if I started applying a moral code to this game, it would be worse ethically somehow, because you'd be trying to justify. None of it is justifiable, at least superficially. And so if you start going down that path, why are you doing any of it, and the fact that I end up thinking about these questions might be the reason I don't play those games, because I feel like I tie myself in knots over it. Although again, I'm not claiming to be squeaky clean moral actor in the games that I play, and I'm sure there's games that I've played where your character is forced to. In fact, I'm going to mention Bioshock in a minute, so absolutely there are things that you do in those games that you can't support morally. Just to circle back to my games, I need to fact check some of the things. So Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is about 3 hours long, not 10. But it is still done on a massive scale, and those 3 hours are really tightly done. So I think it is still a really impressive scale. Maybe if it was a AAA game, it would be 10 hours long, but I don't think it would be a better game for it, to be honest. And also, the light in Firewatch, I was looking that up just to make sure I was right in so the light does change as part to set the emotional tone of the game, and you don't have to take a photo as part of an objective at any point in the game, and at the end they are played in the credits. And in fact, you can, on their website, because it's like a sort of screenshot tool and it saves them, you can log in and then order physical prints of the photos you've taken, which feels like, if I had more time, I would try and reboot my PS4, print one of those out, and then scan that in, and that could be the cover art for this episode. But every second counts, so not going to do that, not yet anyway. To move on to your counter question, which was about when did I start acknowledging the visuals in games, that was well pointed out. I think I was absolutely someone as a kid who was trying to win at the game, trying to beat the game, and wasn't thinking about doing things sort of stylistically. Anytime there were things that were like optional, about trying to do things with flair, I was like skipping those. And I think I can probably pinpoint the sort of time period where that changed for me, and it was working when I was working in the NHS, and my friend Matt started working there. He now teaches in an art school, which fills me with joy, because he spoke about art school as something that really was transformative for him. And it's great, I think, that he's in an environment where he's that now hopefully trying to pass that energy on, and he definitely did to me. I never described myself as an aesthetic person. I remember there was a moment for me when I tried to set up, like a Amiibo, or is it called Amiibo? A Mii character on the Nintendo Wii. And you could, sort of create a little avatar. And I loaded the screen, and it was just me. It had my face, had my hair colour, my haircut, I was wearing a red t-shirt, which is the colour I'd have picked. The features were sort of in proportion. I was just like, oh great, I'm a default character. In this world, I'm an NPC, which, also that's a moment of privilege, isn't it? That I am absolutely represented by large mainstream content, but also harrowing in a different way. And I think one of the reasons that I hadn't, because this goes beyond games, I think one of the reasons that I had skipped over art, I was really into music. The music was, the thing that saved me and carried me through my teen years. But when I'm talking about working for the NHS, I'm talking about being in my late 20s here. This is the period really that I'm talking about. And I think I had inherited this idea, which, again, linking it back to music, is covered by a song called Stenhard Syndrome by the Idols. And this is a belief that I think I inherited from my parents, which is that, like, good art should just take your breath away. You should be, when you see something really, truly magnificent, your breath should just be taken away and you should be in sort of rapture of it. And things like the sort of Mona Lisa or, the Last Supper or whatever, the Da Vinci one, those are things that when you see, you should just break down in tears from the beauty of them. And obviously, like, so this idea of this art is this thing on this pedestal above you, and you should, receive its wonder. And obviously, I sort of, looking at a bunch of religious Renaissance art leaves me fairly cold because I don't have the reference points for it. And it was through, like, working with Matt and seeing his eye and appreciation for things that I shifted to, just engaging with what do I like? What connects with me, what resonates with me, letting go of expectation. And that ended up leading to me discovering, like, drawing and painting. And, I'm not ever going to make a career out of that, or necessarily have it as a skill of, like, oh, Rob, he paint, like, you should get him to do a portrait of you, like, he's great at painting. Like, I'm not someone who can render things perfectly, but what I can do now is create imagery that is close to what I'm picturing and, like, communicates the thing that I want to communicate. And that's, like, a lovely thing to have and to discover. And I think I only have that because of the fact that I got to work every day with this guy. And as part of that, we played Bioshock, and then Bioshock 2, and then the DLC of that, and then Bioshock Infinite. We sort of did a sort of, not simultaneous, but, like, we played it at similar times. And those games are just loaded with brilliant visuals and art. Bringing this back to landscapes, the sequence at the start of Bioshock, where you sort of start in this tower above, like a sort of like a lighthouse. It is a lighthouse, yeah, in this stormy sea, and then you descend down an elevator and you see this sort of collapsed Art Deco 1920s skyscraper New York type buildings, but undersea, and a big squid passes by. It's, like, beautifully scripted. And, like, if you just saw that 3-minute sequence and then we're told, like, oh, the game comes out in a year, you'd be desperate to play it because there's so much to it. And I know you have tried and failed a few times to play the Bioshocks because they also feature some really grisly horror, which isn't to my taste necessarily, but, like, all of the other stuff is, in a way that I really appreciate. And even within that, like, there's, like, paintings up that, like, they like really thought about the world and the space. And I suppose that's less landscapey, that's more about environment and details and texture. But that opening sequence is one that, and in Bioshock Infinite there's a lot of that as well, those sort of vistas and, like, the storytelling that they do with the sort of architecture and the space. Oh man, wonderful stuff. So yeah, I don't know if that's that's my I could have just said about 30. I was about 30, but instead I gave you that. So yeah, if you don't consider yourself an aesthetic person or someone who really appreciates these things, don't feel like it's too late. And try not to be intimidated by the sense that there are things that you're supposed to enjoy. Just find the things that you like and then explore them. And if possible, reinterpret them and put them back out into the world. Not as a podcast, though. We're doing that. This is our territory. Back off. As I mentioned in my response there, I tried to avoid veering into just visuals in games and was trying to stick to landscapes. But one of the memories that it triggered while trying to think of this stuff was a long sort of shaggy dog story that your dad told me once at I guess it was like a family barbecue, maybe it was daughter's first birthday or something. And he'd been playing Far Cry 4, which is the one that's sort of set in a jungle-ish, rainforesty type environment. And your dad, being a fantastic storyteller, managed to sort of spin it out. So I'd love him to be able to drop a voice note of him telling the story. As far as I remember it, the basics of it were that he was trying to cross a river, and he sort of started crossing a river and just got snapped up by an alligator, and so had to reload and was like, okay, we don't cross there. And so instead he like sort of tracked the river down a bit, tried to look for a narrower section. Then he sort of like sprinted across. And he was so like had a moment of little ecstasy where he hadn't been eaten by a crocodile, and then there was a tiger, just like they're instantly eaten by a tiger. I just like, yeah, that was great. So yeah, who knows where that memory's been and what it's been doing in the interim, but it was a good one. So thanks to Papa Tuffs.
Memory complete. Uploading memory.
Thanks for listening to The Memory Game. If you would like to share a gaming memory with us, ask us a question or send us your thoughts, you can contact us at memorygamepod@gmail.com or on Instagram @memorygamepod.